So I want to thank you folks, first of all, for everything that has gone on since we first started the place 100 years ago. Adams Fairacre Farms today, that's the Poughkeepsie store, and it all started with my great-grandfather, and I have a copy of his citizenship. I'll pass it around. You can pass that around. He became a citizen. This picture was taken off of his gravestone. It's at St. Peter's Cemetery on Salt Point Turnpike. And he came over from Italy, and his name was Adamucci, Ralph Adamucci. And we have a couple of other certificates that say his name was Adamico. So we're not positive. But he came over here around, for what I get is that he came back around 1892. He came to America. Some people say 1887. And he came from a little town called Padula in Salerno. That's in Italy near the toe of the boot. And there were some hard times there. I went back and looked a little bit about the history of Italy at the time, and there was evidently a president or a dictator, whatever you want to call it, Francesco Crispi, who kind of ruined the economy, and the population of his town, Padula, was cut in half. It went from 9,300 people in 1871 to 4,500 people in 1921. So some rough times were going on down there, and he was one of the people who got the heck out and decided to move to America. So he came to America and he settled in Poughkeepsie. At the time, a lot of Italian people were coming over from Italy and settling in Poughkeepsie. So he didn't have much family here at the time. So he bought a little farm, and the farm was on where Fox Hill condominiums are now on Cedar Avenue. And I went up there to try to find any remnants of the farm, and I couldn't. I remember about 25 years ago the house was still there, but I didn't see it this time. But that's the mortgage that he took out. He paid $500, and he took out a mortgage. He borrowed it, $500 worth of a mortgage, and he started a farm there, and he started growing vegetables. So this is my great-grandfather with his chickens. And at the time, a lot of people who came over from Italy went into farming. There's a lot of families around the area who can trace their roots back to the early immigration. For example, the Starpolis, as evidenced by Chris Starpoli standing in the back. And we also had the Amatos, and you had the Serinos, a lot of Italian vegetable farmers. And some of them also raised chickens. But my great-grandfather was a vegetable farmer, and he worked pretty hard. There he is with is that Laddie, I think? I don't know. If it is, he must have lived a long time, because I remember Laddie. So he's out there plowing with his horse. Here's his citizenship papers. He became a citizen of the United States. And here's a census. We looked up, and there's a paper from a census taken in the year 1900 that shows James Adamucci, and he came over. Now it says Adamico here. So he came over. It shows that he's the head from Italy, and his wife Rosa, and his son Ralph was 9 years old, who would have been my grandfather. So it says here that my grandfather was born in 1891, and evidently my grandfather came over in 1887, so we're trying to figure out what the heck was going on there. That's why I said I thought he came over in 1892. I didn't want to make it look like, any kind of strange things were going on in Italy at the time. But anyway, this shows that they were here, and their first son was Ralph, who was my grandfather. So he was, James went on to have three other sons, and none of them stayed in the business, but Ralph decided he liked farming. This is a paper that tells that he wants to change his name to Ralph Adams. I mean James Adams. So, and he's trying to say that that he was called Adams for a long time. It also says that he worked in the brickyard. In the winter, a lot of people who were farmers worked in brickyards around the area. For example, on Brickyard Hill, if you go on Route 44 from Poughkeepsie and you head out toward Pleasant Valley, you go up Brickyard Hill. And on Brickyard Hill, where the fire station is on your right, was a brickyard, and where the Kmart on the left was a brickyard also. And Pennock's brickyard was in there. There were a lot of brickyards around the area. A lot of bricks were shipped from Poughkeepsie down to New York City. So they worked in the brickyards in the winter because they weren't farming, to make some extra money. This is the picture that I really can't stand, because whenever this is hanging up on the wall as you walk into the Poughkeepsie store in the entrance, and everybody says, "That's your grandfather? What the heck happened to you?" So that really is a little bit embarrassing. But he was quite a guy. He married here, Mary, right, your mom, and this is Aunt Diana here. And I'm going to show you the next picture. You'll get a kick out of this. Oh, first of all, her degree in flora. She was a member of the Grange, Mary was. And she was quite well known as helping out with a lot of things at the Grange. So we're not sure if a degree in flora had to do with flowers or whether it was just a name. But that shows what she was doing. And there's the picture I want to show. This is Aunt Diana here. Right here. Hey, can you stand up and take a bow or anything? I don't know. This picture was taken 100 years ago. And she's one. And that shows my grandfather and my grandmother, Mary. So it was a pretty nice picture. They made a nice little family there. And they bought a house on Dutchess Turnpike, which was called at the time Salt Point. No, it was called Pleasant Valley Road. It was the Pleasant Valley Road. It ran right in front of, where Overlook Road joins Route 44, almost where the Poughkeepsie store is now. But this was the original house, and it was an old inn. And you told me, I think Aunt Diana told me that they had an outhouse in the back. There was an outhouse in the back, and my grandfather wasn't too fond of that. Neither were you, I don't think, especially in the winter. And they decided to build a new house. Well, that's Aunt Diana on the right. That's Aunt Dorothy, and that's my father, Ralph. And here's a picture of them, my grandfather and grandmother. This here is Donald, Uncle Donald. You here, Uncle Donald? Hey, Uncle Donald, there you are. Last week. Yeah, Aunt Dale's here. Donald's wife, right next to him. And that's my grandfather there, chatting with it. And this was right next to the store, and this was the original store. There's the whole family. My father passed away 2.5 years ago. Aunt Dorothy passed away. She worked in the cheese shop for a long time at the store. She passed away about, I think, 8 years ago, I think. And this is Aunt Diana. There's Uncle Donald up there, and here's my grandmother and grandfather. Now, this is the picture that I wanted to show you. It shows the original store, and the house up there is the house where my mother lives now. And there's my mom in the back. Hey, Ma. And there's the Annie next to her. Okay, my sister. Okay. And so we've got, and there is going to be a picture of Steve, don't worry. So this was the original store. This house here, I got to move this over a little. Okay, that house there is still standing, and my mom still lives in it. If you want to stop and visit her afterwards. And this here is Marlene Weber's spa, which was the original barn where they kept the animals. They had horses to work on the farm, but our family was mostly fruit and vegetable farmers. They didn't really raise a lot of animals. There's a picture of the store, the original store. And I don't think any of these people are here today, but some people used to come up to me and say, you know, I went up one day when your grandfather was before the store. He had a barn here, and I went up to him and I said, you know, Ralph, you ought to cut a little hole in the side of the barn and you know, sell some of the things you grew to the general public there. And I said, that was you? So there it is there with some pumpkins in the front, and you can see that's my mom's house in the back where the family grew up. That was Ralph's my grandfather and grandmother's house where the whole family grew up. There's a picture of the house, and this was in the Poughkeepsie New Yorker, it was called back then, the newspaper. This was in 1940, and that was an article about my grandfather. And he had a reputation for growing really quality stuff. He used to take all the vegetables back then were sold at Clinton Square down in Poughkeepsie, and there was a big open market down there, and a lot of markets like supermarkets or the predecessors of supermarkets like Mohegan Market would come down there and buy the produce to sell. This is what they called the pickle factory. It's down on the South Road. It's now called IBM. This was where all of the Italian vegetable farmers, or any vegetable farmers for that matter, brought all their produce down here to be canned and pickled. They canned a lot of tomatoes here. They made pickles, and then during World War II, they made munitions there, war supplies, and after that, this company called IBM moved in, and that was kind of interesting for Adams, because Adams sort of grew up with IBM. At the time for us, we had all this fresh produce, and we were also selling little plants, little starter plants at the time, because we grew our own vegetable from seed before we put them into the field, and we sold some of the little plants. And the people who worked for IBM they had some money, they had some free time, they were really great people, and they really enjoyed fresh fruit and vegetables, so it was perfect for us. And a lot of them came in and moved near us. For example, Clover Hill, Ireland Estates, all of these places around here that were built in the 1950s were all really built for IBM employees who came streaming into the area until the Hudson Valley had 33,000 IBM employees by the 1980s. So we kind of grew up alongside IBM, and it was really beneficial for us. This is our house, the house where I grew up. After my father got married to my mom, he moved to Ring Road in Salt Point, and that's where I was born, out there in Salt Point. So I got a real pedigree. It's even worse than being born in Pleasant Valley. So this is our cat. I forget its name. There's me and my brother. John's not here today, but he's doing good. And so we had an apple orchard up there, and my father moved out there to get away from home, you know. He got married. So he moved out to Ring Road. We had a nice apple orchard there, and we had a peach orchard. And the peach orchard was killed in a really bad freeze in 1961. If you look up the weather, it was about 30 degrees below zero for about 10 days in 1961. And it killed the actual trees, not just the blossoms. It actually killed the trees. So by then we had moved. My grandfather passed away in 1957, December 10th. And it was quite sudden. He wasn't that old. And it caused a little bit of a difficulty in the family. But what ended up happening was that my grandmother moved into a house next door to the original house. And that became that's where the pastry garden was, the bakery. But before it was that, it was my grandmother's house. And she moved there, and me and my family, my mother and father and sisters and brothers moved back to the farm and decided we lived in the main house. My Uncle Donald and my father got a really strange idea. They wanted to build a new store. So they said they tore down the old store and built a new one, the one that you saw in the previous pictures. So here's I had a diary at the time. I went back and looked at it. I was 9 years old. And so I went back and looked at the diary. There's a couple of entries about them taking down the old store. We called it the stand, right, Aunt Dale? It was called the road stand, we called it. It says, today the old road stand fell down. The workers were standing and crashed. The whole thing came down, but no one was hurt. Today I went to a fair. And then the next day it says, today I caught 12 fish with a paper cup at Kent Falls in Connecticut. We went on the trails. But I wrote that when I was 9 years old, so I have some original sources here. As you can see, this store was actually a radical design for its time, because Uncle Donald here was he was quite interested in architecture at the time. And when he designed this store to look like a farm market, and if you remember around 1959 when this was going on, everything had to look like a spaceship. You know, you had the golden arches, you had cars with these gigantic fins. You ever see the dashboard of an Oldsmobile Rocket 88? But you know, this was considered to be kind of a radical design for a store. And you know, amazingly, not amazingly, because Uncle Donald is quite a prophet, that design is held up. So now today, you see, even now today, new stores are put up that look like that. So right from the beginning, he had a really good design for a store. Now, some people remember the garage doors that were here because the store was closed in the winter and we'd park all the tractors and trucks in there. We had a little garden center here. Now, those greenhouses, this greenhouse here was Donald and Ralph tore it down where it was it was a Violet House on the corner of, well, it was on Violet Avenue, but what's that road that comes from Dutchess Community College? Cottage. Yeah. It was on the corner of Cottage Street and Violet Avenue, 9G. And it was a big old violet house because they grew a lot of violets along there. And they took it down and rebuilt it here. And here's another little greenhouse here. And there's another greenhouse in the back. And this was used to grow the transplants to start the vegetables on the farm. Plant tomato seeds and then go out and plant the little plants in May. And this was a flower garden where people could cut their own cut flowers. And we also had a strawberry patch where people could pick their own strawberries. So it was quite a nice little operation. There was a raspberry patch over here. And then now there's a road going up here to Cherry Hill Condominiums, right up that way. That was actually, I think that might have been on our property or else on the neighboring property. And then you can see there it is in 1968. You can see where the garage doors were and the front of the store. And things were going pretty well. We were growing a lot of vegetables. People want to know what it was like growing up on that farm. My brother and I, we worked on the farm. I think Pat worked on the farm. Did you work on the farm much, Patrick? Okay, yeah. I mean, things were starting, you know, I think the peak of production of vegetables was in the early 70s. And you know, we had to go out. What was that like, Pat?
We worked on the farm too, but it was hard work, you know, backbreaking to some degrees. I guess that's why we shifted more towards the retail.
Pat shifted toward, oh, Sue, you worked on the farm. What'd you do on the farm, Sue? Sue ran the cultivation tractor. She's my wife, by the way, here. So, and there's my grandchildren, and my daughter, and my son-in-law, and Ambika here is the eldest member of the next generation. There's 4 in the next generation. So, but thank you for that, everybody. So working on the farm, I remember we had to pick corn every day at 6 a.m. and get it back to the store by 8 o'clock in the morning when people were going nuts over this fresh produce. You couldn't buy it anywhere else. And so, you know, we'd get out there at 6 o'clock in the morning, we'd start picking the corn, we'd bring it back, and when we brought it back on this big rack body truck, I wish I had pictures of us in the field. I really, if anyone has some, give them to me, because I'm going to give this talk again next year. But we'd come back with this rack body truck filled with bags of corn, or bushel baskets. We'd pick up to 300 bushels a day, and people would be standing there waiting, like, you know, just waiting for this stuff. And we'd pick 300 or 400 half bushels of tomatoes in a day. You know, we just picked all kinds of stuff. And then, of course, President Eisenhower completely wrecked everything because he decided to build a superhighway system. And when he built superhighways, then all of a sudden, all this stuff could come from California. But back in these days, you couldn't get stuff anywhere. You had to buy it local, and it was like a job keeping up. We rented about 4 different properties, 4 or 5 different properties all over the county. We used to go to other places and pick their corn. So my father would have to call up like Milton Kessman and say, hey, could we come pick some corn? Because he'd run out, you know. But it was a big deal. And people ask why we don't grow a lot of, well, we do grow our own produce now. Uncle Donald built a greenhouse with Chris's help, and we're starting to grow our own vegetables again in his high tunnel that he built next to his house. But for a while there, we didn't grow a lot because, for one thing, it was very difficult to keep up. Our business took off, and we could hardly even, you know, the stuff we could grow was like 1% of what we could sell. So we started buying a lot of produce locally from other farmers, which we still do today, and as much as we can. But it's not easy to supply Adams because we can sell a whole tractor trailer load of sweet corn in one day. So, but the other problem with the farm was the soil started to wear out after years and years. And the deer, believe it or not, were a huge problem. I'm not going to say labor was a problem, because we could always find people that... My father was funny. He'd say, whenever he had a good employee, he'd say, oh, that guy will go to IBM. But nowadays, people are quitting IBM to come work for us. So the tables are turned. We got 1,100 employees, Adams does. So, and more than IBM has. So, but anyway, labor wasn't a problem, but the deer, I remember back then in the 60s, if you saw a deer, it was like, quick, go get a camera. A deer, there's a deer, you know, and everybody come running out. Well, I remember the first time we had a nice field of beans, green beans. We used to pick a lot of green beans. And one day this herd of deer came out and ate all the flowers off the tops of the beans. And that's where the beans come, you know, from the flowers. So they ate them all off, and my father couldn't believe it. He said, deer? What the heck? So, you know, when we picked beans, it was funny because we'd have to pick a lot of beans. We'd pick, you know, he'd send us out there in the morning and say, you got to pick like 30 half bushels of beans before 5 o'clock. So we'd be picking beans, you know, really tiring. And so we'd fill each basket like about 3/4 of the way full, and then we'd fluff them up, like this, and then they'd look full, and then we'd load them on the truck, and then on the way back we'd be sitting in the back of the truck. Back in those days, you'd sit in the back of the truck. You didn't have to worry about it, and we'd be sitting in the back of the truck, and the beans, he'd hit a bump, and they'd start to settle down. So we're like fluffing up all the beans all the way home as hard as we can. He probably knew what was going on. There's the garden center. Now, the reason we started to have a garden center really just from growing our own transplants, and then we decided to try growing some flowers in the greenhouses. And then pretty soon that business took off, because once again there was nowhere else to buy this stuff. And a lot of the people who worked at IBM were avid gardeners. So they were such good gardeners that my father actually used to worry that we wouldn't sell many tomatoes in the summer because everybody had their own local tomatoes. So that was pretty crazy. But this is an early scene of the garden center. And one day we were selling tomato plants. We had just planted this field of tomatoes. We planted about maybe 500 tomato plants out in the field. And then we had some left over, so we put them in pots and sold them in pots. And they sold out like in about an hour. So my father said, geez, we got like $3 a pot for these tomato plants, and we don't get $3 worth of tomatoes off of a tomato plant. Go out in the field and dig them back up. Put them back in the pots. So that's what we did. Here's my father. He's watering some of the plants out front, and he's talking to Sam Walton, who came up to visit us one day, giving him a few pointers about retailing. Now this is in here for a reason, because when I was a kid, it was around 1960. This guy came in the parking lot from a place called Coombs Maple Products in Vermont. He came driving down in it's a big square truck, and he had all these different maple products, and he pulls into the store, and he says to my dad, you ought to sell some of these. Well, these aren't life size. They're like about 3 inches tall. So he says, you ought to sell some of these things because, people will buy them. And my father says, no, we only sell what we grow. We don't sell anything other than what we grow. That's our policy. And then me and my brother were standing there. We go, Dad, come on. Come on, Dad, you got to get them. So he goes, okay. And of course they sold great. Now we sell stuff from all over the world, right? We don't have to worry about just selling what we grow. But that was the beginning of it, the Coombs Maple Products. Now here's Donald, my dad, and Lenny Futima, and they're getting ready to make a major expansion there. I'm not sure, that must have been around 1974. Look at the hair. It must have been around 1972 or so when people had hair down to there. And so they're getting ready to dig up the ground for the cheese shop. We had a cheese shop, right? And there's Debbie. She was in on it. She was in on the ground floor of the cheese shop. So she's hanging in there. And that's Lenny. He was our landscape manager for a long time. That's a picture to show we moved everything back there, and I wanted to show my greenhouses up here. So I started to get in the greenhouse business because I saw the handwriting on the wall with the farm, so I decided that I'd start doing greenhouse work, and I still do that. So I started my greenhouse business in 1978, and there I am a few years ago, the day before yesterday. I put this in to show our Kingston store, and I wanted to mention that Michael Ogello, Diana's son, built the Kingston store, the Newburgh store, and the Wappinger store. He was a very famous builder, and he passed away last year unexpectedly, but he did a great job building these stores, so we can thank him for that. And there's a memorial for him out in the front of the Wappinger store if you take a right over by the parking lot there. And this is a picture of the Newburgh store, and there's a picture of the Wappinger store when it was first built. It was, this is a ribbon cutting ceremony. Oh, now this is just a picture to show one of the last years of on the farm when we were growing lots of tomatoes. There's my father and uncle on the front of Duchess magazine, one of their many articles written about them. And here's a picture of Patrick and Steve. Okay, I got a picture of Steve in there, good. And that's Donald there, and they're getting one of their many awards. And I think that's Mark Molinaro on the side there, and I think it's Rob Rollison on the other side when he was head of the legislature. And there's Pat, the CEO of Adams, who's keeping up. I'll tell you, if you get to know Pat, you know that he's a real down-to-earth guy, and you can just go up and ask him anything, which he'll be here for a couple hours to answer your questions. And there's my dad with Ambika, one of the 4 great-grandchildren. So that was at his 90th birthday party. And there's our newest addition to the store, which is the bakery in Poughkeepsie. And the reason there was no bakery for a while is because of the pastry garden being there. And now we have our own bakery. So have I left people out here? I don't know. But I think I'm pretty much done. Oh, yeah. Here's a little plug for my Irish band. We're playing at Paula's Public House on St. Patrick's Day. So come on up to Paula's. There's our band members. And come on up to Paula's and see us from 5 o'clock to 8 o'clock on St. Patrick's Day. I think they call that cross-marketing. Okay. So thank you very much. And that's my talk. If anyone got here late, I'm going to give the talk again at 1 o'clock. Thanks, everybody.